Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is India's neighborhood diplomacy, and for this discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Aryabhatta College, Department of Political Science, University of Delhi, and his area of specialization is Indian politics and political thought, public administration and India's foreign policy, amongst many others, of course, and he has been teaching for the last 23 years. And with this introduction, I would like to welcome sir. Thank you so much, sir, for coming, and I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Lucy. In fact, today's topic for discussion is India's neighborhood diplomacy, and in this discussion, I would like to focus on 2-3 different issues. First of all, there is a debate that does India have any policy towards its neighbors, and then that debate takes into account that number of factors, that how India is located in this region of the world, that is South Asia, and therefore India's relationship with neighbor of course has seen many ups and downs in in recent times, but nonetheless there are certain factors which are now basically moving in direction of cooperation, collaboration and friendly ties with the neighbors, because any country, any power which aspires to be a big force on the world scene has to basically keep its neighbors happy and has to have a very friendly relationship with its neighbor, and India is no exception. The best example is United States of America. For example, recently we have seen that how United States has even normalized its strained relationship with Cuba. Because the Latin America, because United States neighborhood includes Latin America, and a very friendly relationship with countries of Latin America is very important for United States global role as a superpower. So, I mean what happens in Latin America, what applies to United States of America and what applies to many other big countries, important players in the world politics, that also applies to India. Now, we will come to that issue later, but I would like to divide the discussion into 2-3 parts. Number one, that does India have a policy towards its neighbor, and number two, that what type of relationship basically is in operation so far as its neighborhood diplomacy is concerned, and third, I would also like to focus that what are the changes which one can see taking place since 90s, particularly after the onset of this globalization and economic changes which have taken place in the entire world. So, to begin with, first of all, I would like to discuss that what type of India's diplomacy one can see in its neighborhood. Now, here one thing is very important, that any foreign policy of any country basically keeps into account number of factors, but the most important factor is the national interest. So, no country would like to sacrifice its national interest for normalizing its relationship with any countries. So, normalization is important, but the rider is that it has to be in tune with the national interest of a country. So, India accordingly has charted out its course so far as the foreign policy is concerned, where it has tried to harmonize its national interest and its relationship in neighborhood. Now, there are 2 factors which one should remember that has has determined India's role in this part of the world, that is South Asia, and the 2 factors are number one, that the colonial history, because India has inherited a colonial history, and the colonial history has played a very important role, because we should remember that India was under the British rule for a very long period of time in history, and during that rule, most importantly, the border with its neighboring countries was shaped and reshaped a number of times according to the convenience and the interest of the colonial powers. So, India has inherited that legacy, and that legacy is determining to a great extent India's relationship with its neighbor, particularly 2 important neighbors, China and Pakistan. So, I mean this colonial legacy no one can ignore while discussing India's neighborhood diplomacy, because this is perhaps one of the biggest stumbling block so far as the cooperation in South Asia is concerned, particularly within the framework of SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, because there are many countries who aspire for a kind of framework in this part of the world on a pattern of what we see in Southeast Asia in form of ASEAN, or in Europe in form of European Union, or for that matter many other continents of the world. But in South Asia, basically there are 2-3 important factors which impede such cooperation, and one is this India-Pakistan relationship. We will come to this issue later when we will specifically discuss India's relationship with some of its neighbors. Now, so this colonial history is important. The second important factor is the geographical preponderance of India, because geographically India is perhaps the most important player in international politics so far as the South Asia is concerned. In fact, in terms of its width and length, in terms of geographical expansion, in terms of the resources, natural resources, in terms of in fact a demographic profile, the population, in terms of even the political system, because India has maintained an uninterrupted democratic system for last 6 decades or so. So, all these things perhaps go in adding to India's strength, and that preponderance, both political and otherwise, sometimes works against this cooperation in South Asia, because that creates a kind of anxiety in the minds of many neighbors that India's power would be basically used against its neighbors. So, I mean this is a dilemma for India also, because every country in international politics aspires to augment its power, and India is no exception. So, national interest includes also the augmentation of power, and India also aspires to be important nation in the world affairs, and therefore India's aspiration is quite genuine. But the moment India basically seeks to augment its power, the neighbors start believing that it is India's hegemony in this part of the world. So, the two allegations which were quite common, and we frequently hear about these two allegations. One is India's hegemony in the South Asia, that India is trying to impose its hegemony to the extent that many people call it is a Monroe Doctrine, India's Monroe Doctrine in South Asia, because Monroe Doctrine associated with American President Monroe, who basically propounded this doctrine vis-a-vis Latin America. So, therefore, it is applied in case of South Asia, and it is alleged that India is trying to practice the similar Monroe Doctrine in context of the South Asia. So, that is number one. The second allegation which we often hear is the cultural imperialism, that India is trying to practice cultural imperialism in this part of the world, because India's geographical strength, India's cultural heritage, and so on and so forth. So, basically it is trying to impose its culture, its tradition, its political will on its neighbors. So, these two allegations we frequently hear, but here from the India's point of view there is a dilemma, that how to reconcile the two things. Number one, how to augment its power, which every country in the world affairs would like to do, and at the same time to assuage the feelings of its neighbor, to at least give this impression to them that India's power is not essentially meant against them. Rather, if India becomes powerful in course of time, even the neighbors would be benefited by India's rise in the global affairs. So, I mean this dilemma has been sought to be handled in a different ways by different leaders, by different prime ministers, different policy makers in their own way. We will come to that issue later, but nonetheless this dilemma is at the heart of India's neighborhood diplomacy. That is, that how to augment power, how to increase its its power in world affairs, how to increase its stature in world affairs, and at the same time without giving this impression to its neighbors that India's rise is not essentially in their is not going to be unfavorable to them. So, this is the dilemma. Now, in context of this dilemma, one can see that a anti-India feeling normally informs the policies of its neighbors, so far as their foreign policy is concerned. Now, with Pakistan and China one can understand, because there are border disputes. And as I mentioned earlier, those disputes are basically a kind of colonial legacy. In case of Pakistan, because the partition, the common history, and then the partition in 1947, and the kind of situation which emerged after that in terms of the border disputes, particularly in context of one particular region, that is Jammu and Kashmir. That issue of course has influenced and colored India's relationship with Pakistan, along with certain other factors which emerged later, particularly the cross border terrorism and the nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. Similarly with China, there are of course a big colonial hangover, for example, colonial legacy. For example, this border dispute with China, this McMahon line, the sanctity of McMahon line, and the 1962 aggression. And since then, of course, attempts have been made from the both sides to normalize the relationship, and things are now looking up and things are moving in the right direction. But nonetheless, there are certain issues to be sorted out. So with these two neighbors, one can see the reason for a kind of very cold relationship over the years. But with other neighbors, interestingly, even with some neighbors in whose affairs India has played a very important role from very beginning, even in those countries one can see a kind of anti-India feeling becoming very dominant and a factor in politics, domestic politics in those countries. And here one can cite the example of Bangladesh, one can cite the example of Nepal, one can cite the example of Maldives, and one can also cite the example of Sri Lanka. So, I mean these are the countries where one can find that India has been struggling to have a very friendly tie with these countries, in spite of the best efforts over the years to basically accommodate the concerns of these neighbors. Now, for example, in 2001, just on basis of a rumor, one could see that the riot breaking out in Nepal, based on some movie or some film. Similarly, one can see that some of the territories of these neighbors are used for anti-India activities, particularly for the terrorist activities. Similarly, one can see that in domestic politics, the kind of public opinion which is generated, and that public opinion is largely India centric, that any political party in those countries which basically gives this impression that it will follow a tough anti-India policy becomes popular, at least in some of these countries who are basically our neighbors. So, I mean this type of anti-India feeling one can see across these neighborhood countries, and that is something very strange and very disturbing, because for example Bangladesh, India played a role of a midwife in the birth of that nation, that is Bangladesh, in 1971, and the friendly ties between the two countries continued, but could not be sustained over the years, and we find that there are many ups and downs. For example, these days the relationship is moving in a very right direction, but nonetheless one can see many ups and downs over the years. In the case of Nepal also, we have had a very important and significant treaty with Nepal in 1950, but still we find that the borders are porous, there are many cultural similarities, there are ethnic similarities. Nonetheless, we find that even in Nepal things are not in a very good shape. Even the entire attempt to frame the constitution, and even the entire movement for democracy, and India's very positive role in creating a kind of atmosphere for birth of a democratic system in Nepal. In spite of that, there are certain forces whose actions, whose basically utterances are at times inimical to India's interest. Now, similarly one can see in case of the Maldives, 1988, when an attempt was made by some mercenaries to topple the government of Gayoom, I mean India intervened within a fraction of second and basically salvaged the situation, rescued that government from its problem and its predicament. But still we find that even in Maldives some anti-India sentiments have gained ground over the years, and the rise of fundamentalism, obscurantism and terrorism on the soil of Maldives are not a very good sign so far as India's neighborhood diplomacy is concerned. Now, Sri Lanka, of course, there is a ethnic issue involved in this relationship, and as many of us know that the Tamils who have been a very important part of the Sri Lankan society and polity, and their grievances have always colored India's relationship with Sri Lanka, so much so that a accord was signed 1987. The peacekeeping force was sent to bring normalcy in Sri Lanka, but that did not work out properly, and in spite of massive losses which India suffered on account of that, even that contribution is seldom acknowledged, and the rise of LTT as a militant force to safeguard the interest of the Tamilians and that long warfare which took place in Sri Lanka has of course influenced and colored India's relationship with Sri Lanka, but still there is an attempt in direction of having a friendly ties with Sri Lanka, but still one can see that that the relationship is not free from all the problems. Now, with Afghanistan, one can say that with the birth of new Afghanistan, one can say after 9/11 and the end of the Taliban's rule and the attempt to frame a democratic constitution, to have a democratically elected government, has changed the entire scenario in Afghanistan, and things are moving in the right direction, but still one can see that there are certain forces which are inimical to the interest of India. They are always active in Afghanistan with the help and cooperation of some other countries, and therefore one can also place Afghanistan in the same category where anti-India sentiments are there. So, I mean, this is the situation, this is the kind of this is the kind of atmosphere, this is the kind of environment all over South Asia in which India's neighborhood diplomacy operates. Now, in this context, as I mentioned, that there are two set of dilemmas. One is that how to reconcile economic dependence and cultural similarity with the political anxiety in the neighborhood, so far as the question of forming a separate national identity is concerned, because national identity is very important issue here, because every country seeks to create and carve out a separate national identity, and that national identity sometimes, unfortunately, in this part of the world becomes anti-India platform, because they feel that their identity can be created, can be recognized in world affairs and world politics only if they take a very strident anti-India position. So, this is something very disturbing so far as this South Asia is concerned. And second issue is that India's regional security, India basically tries to create a kind of regional security for this subcontinent within a framework in which it believes that the exclusion of the foreign power is very important for creating this security framework for South Asia, because India's experience has been that whenever there has been interference, whenever there has been a presence of the foreign powers in this part of the world, that has disturbed the stability, security and peace of this continent. The best example is 1979 Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. Now, we have seen that how that invasion led to a kind of Cold War politics in this region, and this Cold War politics, which was basically coming to this this continent only occasionally, became a regular feature after 79. The USSR conflict on the issue of Afghanistan led to a different type of scenario altogether, where United States of America supported certain forces who were trying to fight the Soviet presence in Afghanistan in name of religion, and that gave birth to this fundamentalist politics which eventually culminated into terrorism, and we are basically the worst victim of that terrorism from across the border and from some parts surrounding Afghanistan. So, therefore, we have seen that how the presence of the external forces in the South Asia have always been detrimental to the interest of India, and therefore, India always tries to keep the big powers out of the sphere of the South Asia, and this unfortunately gives this impression to the neighbors that India is trying to practice Mundo doctrine in South Asia, rather trying to create South Asia as exclusive region of its dominance, and therefore, they try to sometimes challenge it, they try to sometimes resist it, but they can't appreciate India's position, that India simply wants to keep the foreign forces, foreign powers out of this sphere of the world, simply because they feel that it will not be only detrimental to India's interest, but this will also be detrimental to interest of some of its neighbors. But the neighbors, so far of this policy is concerned, they do not take it quite lightly, or they sometimes question it, they sometimes challenge it, and therefore, what they do in order to counter this, they sometimes bring in United States of America, sometimes they bring China, sometimes they bring gang up with Pakistan. So, number of permutations and combinations emerge in order to basically counter this doctrine, or if not doctrine, this strategy of India, that to have a situation where the foreign powers are out from South Asia, and there should be a kind of bilateral interaction, negotiations, agreements, bilateral exchange with neighbors by keeping the third party out of this entire scenario. So, this is not sometimes taken that way by the neighbors. So, now in this context, now the next issue which becomes very important, that is the issue of of India's neighborhood diplomacy, that does India have a theory, a framework to deal with its neighbors. Now, there are two types of opinions on this. One opinion believes that India does not have any neighborhood diplomacy. India simply looks at its neighbors, looks at the problems which come from the neighbors as and when they emerge. In context of the basically occurrence of a particular issue, India seeks to deal with its neighbors. India does not have a very uniform, systematic coherent framework to deal with its neighbor. This is position number one. There is another position on the same issue, that no, it is not true. India has a framework to deal with its neighbor, and that framework is the framework of bilateralism. Because bilateralism is perhaps the time tested framework for India's neighborhood diplomacy, and the best example, many scholars, many people believe, that is basically seen in terms of the Simla Accord with Pakistan in 1971, after 1971 war, that the Simla agreement is nothing but a bilateral, making things bilateral. In fact, even the Kashmir issue was brought from the international framework to a bilateral framework, that it is a bilateral problem between India and Pakistan and has to be resolved bilaterally without having a third party negotiation. So, bilateralism, this set of opinion believes that perhaps is at the heart of India's neighborhood diplomacy, and the Simla agreement between India and Pakistan is perhaps the best example, best illustration of this framework. Now, here but then one sees, and a lot of the critiques of this bilateralism, the theory of bilateralism, or framework of bilateralism as the heart of India's neighborhood diplomacy, they also argue that there is a contradiction in this framework. For the critics, this bilateralism does not cohere with India's position on number of issues in international affairs. For example, they point out that in international sphere, India always championed multilateralism. Since the days of non-aligned movement, since the days of since India's emergence on the world scene in 1947, India has always propagated, India has also always practiced, and India has always championed multilateralism. Whereas, this bilateralism in the South Asian context basically militates against this framework. So, therefore, there is a contradiction between the two frameworks. How a country like India can justify two different positions in two different spheres, in international affairs, multilateralism, and in the regional affairs, bilateralism. So, this is a contradiction. Now, the second thing, the critics also point out that this India's attempt to have India's tirade against protectionism in trade at international level in the world scenario sometimes does fit nicely with India's attempt within the South Asian context to have a kind of trade policy where many critics point out, even some of the neighbors point out, that India basically tries to promote protectionism. So, these two contradictions are often highlighted in India's neighbourhood diplomacy, particularly from the point of view of this position that India has a framework, and that framework is the framework of bilateralism. Many people feel that this bilateralism, even if we accept it, that it is central to India's discourse in the neighbourhood, even then we find a contradiction with its position in the world politics, because there India champions multilateralism, not bilateralism. Now, in context of this debate, no one can deny that bilateralism is very important for India's foreign policy, and therefore bilateralism, so far as the neighbourhood diplomacy, one can see its relevance also, because bilateralism is essentially meant to basically checkmate the kind of infiltration of the foreign forces which we find in this part of the world, particularly the superpowers. Since the days of Cold War, we have seen that how the big powers and superpowers always try to meddle into the affairs of South Asia, and therefore India, being a very important country in this region, always believed that its national interest was under threat if the big powers came and made their presence felt in this part of the world. Therefore, in order to keep them out, India always tried to basically promote this idea of bilateralism, and in context of Pakistan this becomes more important, because we have seen that how in 1971 the both countries have penned a very important agreement called Shimla Accord. Now, in light of this situation of this bilateralism which India suits India so far as the South Asia is concerned, we can see that in 90s things have started changing in 90s, and the causes for these changes were some were out of India's control, because those changes were being triggered by certain developments outside South Asia. That was largely due to the changes in the world politics, and one important change was the end of Soviet Union and the end of power bloc politics, and also end of the Cold War. The second important change was, of course, the rise of a new kind of economic scenario which was characterized as globalization. Now, with globalization we find that number of changes took place in the world politics, and one of the important change was that there was a new wind which started blowing, and that was the wind of regionalization or regionalism. There was an attempt to basically create a framework for regional cooperation in different parts of the world. For example, European Union, even if it was there, it got a new life. You had the ASEAN, you had similar regional cooperation in Africa, you had similar regional cooperation in in America, and so you find that a new situation emerged for regional cooperation, and the advantages which many countries saw in this kind of regional cooperation were basically far more than the situation where there was a kind of animosity or no friendly ties with the neighbors. So, regional cooperation became very important in 90s, and here we should remember that so far India is concerned, there was a background of regional cooperation, because South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation started or took off in 1985 with the initiative of Bangladesh's President Ziaur Rahman. But what happened that since 1885, since 1985, this regional cooperation has been there, but now much headway could be made, and therefore this 90s with this new changes, particularly this globalization and the similar initiatives for regional cooperation emerging in different parts of the world, that gave some new energy, that gave some new motivating factor for the countries of South Asia to move in direction of this regional cooperation. So, SHARC here becomes very important, and of course, compared to what it was earlier, now you find that lot of new developments have taken place. We will come to this issue later, so far as the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is concerned. Now, But one thing we should remember, that by 90s the changes which were taking place at the global level, that made it quite apparent that earlier policies, not only on part of India, but even some of India's neighbors, will become unsustainable in course of time, because the world had changed. And therefore, in that context, one issue of course was regionalism. The another issue was that how to have a friendly ties with neighbors, because unless you put your own house in order, and here own house means your neighborhood, you can't play a very important role on world politics. And secondly, unless you take on on the big powers, unless you put a joint front on international fora like World Trade Organization, unless you present yourself as a cohesive force in world politics, I think a message was sent out that the smaller countries will have no role in the coming decades and coming years. So therefore, this entire thing started changing in 90s, but unfortunately that didn't that didn't dawn on our neighbors the way it should have been, and they continued to cling on to their own policies, sometimes using United States of America, sometimes using China, sometimes using Pakistan, and basically most of their policies were India centric. They didn't take into account the new world scenario, they didn't take into account the changes which took place in the global politics, and therefore they suffered on account of this. When the entire world started growing very fast, some of the neighbors were still caught in anti-India centric policies and politics, and therefore they remained where they were earlier. So I mean, this is something from the point of view of the neighbors. But from the point of view of India, India's stakes were higher than the neighbors, because India aspired to play a very important role in world politics. 90s witnessed many changes so far as India's domestic policies are concerned. For example, economic reforms which took place in 90s. India basically charted out a new type of foreign policy for its Southeast Asian neighbors or Southeast Asian countries, and that has come to be known as Lookist policy. India even normalized its relationship, rather became very friendly with United States of America compared to the kind of relationship which operated earlier. So India started reframing, reformulating, relooking at India foreign policy, and therefore the neighborhood diplomacy also came under the purview of this new thinking, that what to do with neighborhood diplomacy, what to do with our neighbors. And it is here that there are certain initiatives, there were certain initiatives in 90s which become very important, and two important names can be cited here. One was Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister from 91 to 96, and that was the time when India basically had a relook at its foreign policy initiatives in world affairs. And then subsequently for a 2 years period there was a coalition government, and then there was a foreign minister, and subsequently became Prime Minister Indra Kumar Gujral, and he propounded a framework or a kind of doctrine for neighborhood diplomacy, which has come to be known as Gujral doctrine. That is also very significant, because these two initiatives of 90s were basically meant to normalize the relationship with neighbors, put the relationship at a very even level, to create a kind of situation in South Asia where India does not get bogged down to the domestic affairs, and India gets enough space and time to look towards the larger global issues, and where India can get a place befitting its stature, befitting its resources, befitting its strength. So I mean, this was the initiative, but that initiative did not stop with the Gujral doctrine. When Atal Bihari Vajpayee became Prime Minister, he also took number of initiatives, particularly vis-a-vis Pakistan, and therefore the important initiative was this bus ride to Lahore, then the Lahore Declaration, and then subsequently some agreements on the nuclear weapons and so on and so forth with Pakistan. But at the same time with other countries also, attempts were made during that period to create a better atmosphere in the South Asia so far as India's foreign policy is concerned. Now, that process which started in 90s did not stop at all, it went on and on. For example, even the subsequent UPA government, UPA 1, UPA 2, we found the similar initiatives coming, and recently with the new Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we find that a similar initiative has been there. For example, even in his oath taking ceremony, he invited the leaders of all South Asian countries to participate. That was very out of the box thinking, and one can say very courageous and very important initiative on the part of the Prime Minister to have a neighborhood diplomacy. So, what we find that since 90s there has been a consistent attempt on the part of India to basically create a different type of South Asia, where India can freely act in the world affairs without having any problems in its neighborhood, where India's energy and resources, India's potential can be unleashed, where India can find a rightful place among the community of nations without getting bogged down to trivial issues and the minor issues pertaining to the neighbors. Now, it is here Gujarat doctrine is very important, because what Gujarat at that time insisted, or rather propagated through his doctrine, that India should simply bend backward. India should bend backward and accommodate the concerns of its neighbors without expecting any reciprocity from them. Particularly this applied to the smaller neighbors like Nepal, like Maldives, like Bhutan, like Bangladesh, even Sri Lanka. One can India should bend backward, and India should try to accommodate their concerns, their grievances without expecting any reciprocity. So far as the bigger neighbors are concerned, India should try to normalize relationship and address their concerns, and that way India can create a framework. But the problem is that with Gujarat doctrine, that the bending backward is perfectly okay, but the thing is that how far India can bend backward, how much India can accommodate the concerns and interests and the grievances of its neighbors. No country would like to bend backward to the extent that it will fall down on the ground. Therefore, if the neighbors expect that India should keep bending backward and there is no end to their grievances, there is no end to their demands, then it becomes difficult for India, it can become difficult for any country, how much accommodative it may try to be in world affairs. So, this is something, a kind of concern for India and India's policy makers, so far as the neighborhood diplomacy is concerned. But nonetheless, now coming to this history of India's neighborhood diplomacy, as I hinted earlier, that initially during Nehru's time, the entire thing was seen through the prism of non-alignment and Cold War politics, and Nehru tried to keep neighbors happy, and the best example is China. For example, this Chinese aggression, for Chinese aggression many people blame the policies of Nehru, because Nehru was totally unmindful of India's security concerns and never believed that a neighbor like China would ever invade India, but his hopes were belied and there was a Chinese invasion in 1962. Now, similarly with other countries also, Nehru tried to present a different type of accommodative stance. For example, with Kashmir issue, he took to United Nations and he basically thought that a more honorable solution should be found out, but that was also belied, because Pakistan defied the logic of democratic solution, and in fact tried to create or try to kind of pinprick India too often on the issue of Kashmir. So, with other countries also, during Nehru's time, the attempt was to have a more democratic and honorable solution of impending issue or of the pending issues, and of course, he was a kind of a statesman who was basically had a cosmopolitan outlook. So, he tried to look even the South Asian region through the prism of the world politics, and non-alignment therefore was important framework for Nehru. Now, his daughter Mrs. Gandhi, who was Prime Minister, and she tried to deal with the neighbors through a different type of framework, and it is here this bilateralism is very important, and this similar accord with Pakistan perhaps was also during her time. So, that tells something that what was her mindset so far as neighborhood diplomacy is concerned, because she always tried to propagate and practice bilateralism. Now, since then, as I have mentioned, that things have started changing. For example, even Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, in fact, there were certain important initiatives. The most important initiative was the birth of the SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, because South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation emerged in 1985. And 1985 was the time when he was the Prime Minister, and he basically believed that the regional cooperation in this part of the world is very important, and India's interests lay in a very sturdy and sound framework of cooperation for South Asia. Even on question of Sri Lanka, in fact, Rajiv's policies were quite proactive. So far as LTT was concerned, IPKF was concerned. On the issue of the Tamilian, the ethnic issue in Sri Lanka, Rajiv took a very proactive stance. But nonetheless, he also wanted a more, friendly framework to deal with its neighbors. And as I have seen, as I have discussed that since 90s, altogether new set of factors colored and influenced India's neighborhood diplomacy, and since then we have been seeing that how changes have been taking place. Now, in light of this type of situation, there are certain factors which one can see influencing the new policy in terms of the thinking of India's diplomacy. Now that these policies are in terms of three pronged issues. Number one, that the issue of globalization, that this is a reality and there is no escape from it. Now, how to deal with this situation? Should India try to deal with this global world alone as a country of resources, ample resources, country of ample potential, as a country which is already playing important role, or should India also mobilize the forces and resources in South Asia and take on this global world as a cohesive group of 8 South Asian countries who are the members of the SAARC. So, this is one important kind of issue in the new policy thinking so far as India's neighborhood diplomacy is concerned. Second is that what type of role India aspires in the global affairs. Now, this is something very important, because as the strategic thinkers in the world, they look at the world from look at the world 30 or 40 years down the line. They believe that India and China are going to play a very important role, because both are the emerging economies, and as it is believed that India has some additional advantage of having a democratic system, of having a demographic dividends. So, India is set to play important role 20 years hence, 30 years hence, and therefore, keeping that thing in mind, setting the eyes on that mission, how India can look at its neighborhood, how can India in what way India should basically frame its policies towards its neighbors, where it facilitates its rise in the world affairs. And the third is that how to create a commonality of interests with neighbors, because there are many irritants, no one can deny it. There are irritants with Pakistan, there are irritants with Bangladesh, there are irritants with Sri Lanka. There is hardly any country in this region with which India does not have certain irritants in irritants for friendly ties. But nonetheless, in spite of those irritants, how India can chart out a new course so far as neighborhood diplomacy is concerned, where some commonality of interests is created. So, this is something very important. Now, in this context, we can see that initiatives have been taken, and those initiatives are quite significant. For example, in 1996, India renewed the Ganga water treaty with Bangladesh. Basically, India has had a old treaty with Nepal 1950. Now, India has tried to basically address some of the grievances of Nepal on account of that treaty. Similarly, with Pakistan, India has taken number of initiatives, but unfortunately most of the initiatives have not worked. For example, as I mentioned earlier, this bus service between Lahore and Delhi started with Vajpayee as India's Prime Minister and his bus ride to Lahore. Then similarly, the attempt to create a SAFTA in this region of the world, that is free trade agreement in 2008, that is another significant development so far as the economic diplomacy is concerned. Similarly, you have seen that in field of education, in science and technology, in communication, number of initiatives have been taken. In education, one can see that how the establishment of South Asian University in Delhi at the initiative of SARC is another significant move. The science and technological exchanges and the number of initiatives for kind of collaboration, that is something very significant. We have seen that how this popularity and rise of track 2 diplomacy among these neighborhood countries, civil society interaction, students exchange program, teachers exchange program. These are the initiatives which India has been at the center of the entire development, where India has tried to create a different framework where peoples to peoples people contact becomes more intense, and that will perhaps facilitate in course of time as a more friendly ties with neighbors. Now there are cultural exchanges taking place among these countries, but then there are also certain roadblocks, and the roadblocks are mostly on account of terrorism, roadblocks are mostly on account of nuclear diplomacy, roadblocks are mostly on issue of the border disputes. So these are the roadblocks, but nonetheless there are initiatives also. But if we look at the overall scenario, we find that in spite of these initiatives, the climate is not changing. The entire India feeling, which basically inform the policies of these neighbors, there is no mitigation in that anti-India feeling, and it is perhaps a matter of concern for India and India's neighborhood diplomacy. Now there are certain inherent weaknesses, no one can deny it, for a robust and powerful framework for South Asian cooperation. Now there are inherent weaknesses, and that weakness is largely on account of certain factors, like for example India's preponderance, geographical preponderance, and then there is asymmetry of power in this part of the world. Now that asymmetry of power does not allow in fact many other countries in this part, that is South Asia, to see that how India's how the entire South Asian cooperation can move and can become more effective by keeping India at the center of these activities and development. But they simply feel that if India comes at the center of these activities, this will be basically kind of imposition of hegemony of one important player in this region, and therefore they simply try to checkmate India. And while checkmating India, sometimes they mobilize forces which are detrimental or inimical to India's interest, and perhaps that puts India off, and India always feel that these countries are basically not interested in cooperation, but these countries are simply interested in basically running down India, in harming India's interest, and they are simply ganging up for no benefit of theirs, but simply to derive illusory satisfaction that India is going to suffer on account of that. So this is something weakness in basically for any robust framework for South Asian cooperation. Another is this: within the SARC there is a provision for consensual decision, that all decisions have to be taken consensually, and that becomes sometimes difficult, because arriving at a consensus in a situation like South Asia is not easy, because arriving at a consensus in a group where both India and Pakistan are present sometimes becomes intractable, and therefore that is another hindrance. Now secondly, that there is no enforcement mechanism within the SARC itself. For example, of course it has a headquarter in Kathmandu, it has a now established framework. Now I mean there is some regularity also in its conferences, but nonetheless there is no enforcement agency. The third important thing outside the framework of SAARC, or in fact it is important even for SAARC also. That is the democracy, that India is the only country which has uninterrupted democratic experiment for last 6 decades. Other countries, of course, some of the countries become democratic, but that is not sustained for long, and again they basically slip to some undemocratic moments. For example, they are the entire thing is entire thing goes in direction of military rule and so on and so forth. So, democracy is another because a stumbling block, because if there is a commonality in terms of the political systems, then there is more possibility, more scope of cooperation. So, like India, if other countries also move in direction of democracy and remain democratic for long, then perhaps that will be good for future of this region, as well as future of the cooperation, as well as for future of India's neighborhood diplomacy. So, that is another important thing. And the next important basically irritant is the approach and role of the big powers in South Asia. But from the very beginning, the big powers have always been looking at South Asia as their playground, and they have been interfering and meddling into affairs of South Asia. And now it started during the time of Cold War, and it has continued even after the end of Cold War. Now, sometimes earlier it used to be Soviet Union and United States of America, now it is mostly United States of America and China. So, I mean big powers interference sometimes militates against the spirit of cooperation and friendship in this part of the world. As I mentioned in the very beginning, that India's entire perspective on the security, peace and stability of South Asia is totally at variance with this approach of the superpowers, because India always believes that for the stability and security and peace of the South Asia, it is important that the outside powers keep themselves out of the sphere of the politics in this region, because if it is left to the countries of this region, it will be good both for the world peace and prosperity, and it will also good for the countries of South Asia. But this argument is not appreciated, this argument is not bought by both India's neighbors as well as the superpowers. Now, what is happening that in context of overall this India's neighborhood diplomacy, one can here briefly mention that what type of issues are there with India's neighbors. For example, with China, as you have seen, that the most important irritant is the border dispute, but there is also now emerging there is a commonality or convergence of interest on number of issues between India and China, and one of the most important issue on which this convergence can be seen is in terms of economic development and economic growth, and basically working together in the global fora, particularly World Trade Organizations and similar other forums in the world sphere, where India and China both basically have similar set of concerns, and therefore they sometimes act also together. But then some old issues, some hangover from the past, they do not allow India and China to basically collaborate the way they should be collaborating in these matters. So, I mean with China we have seen the main irritant is this border, and economic competition is there, but one can also see some collaboration. With Pakistan, of course, the most important irritant is the issue of Kashmir, but along with Kashmir, from the India's point of view, the biggest irritant is the cross border terrorism and the nuclear issue. Of course, since India and Pakistan both are nuclear power, and now there is also some sort of agreement governing that issue. So, that is not the major problem at the moment, but the major problem is the cross border terrorism and the issue of Kashmir, because Pakistan still believes that Kashmir is a disputed area. India believes that Kashmir is not a disputed area, but the biggest dispute is on the issue of Pakistan's approach towards Kashmir, where it adopts terrorism as an instrument of its foreign policy, and therefore, this becomes very important. With Nepal, we have seen this water issue has been a kind of issue, but still we can see some development on that front, where India and Nepal have tried to basically deal with this issue through negotiations and other channels of diplomacy. But then recently we have seen that the entire attempt to frame a new constitution, democratic constitution, the turmoil in Nepal, and India's very positive role in direction of creating a democratic polity in Nepal, that should be appreciated across the board. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, that there are forces in Nepal which are inimical to India's interests, and therefore, one can see that there are certain irritants there also. Sri Lanka, of course, the old age-old problem of this Tamil issue, the ethnic issue is still there. There have been attempts to basically sort it out, but still it has not shown much results. But one can see that at least the channels of diplomacy are active. There are attempts to basically resolve all pending issues through dialogue and negotiation. Therefore, one can see that irritants are there, but nonetheless, India's neighbourhood diplomacy vis-a-vis Sri Lanka is still active and hoping to arrive at some negotiated settlement. Maldives, as we have discussed that 1988, how India's quick intervention in the Maldives salvaged the situation and rescued that beleaguered government of Gayoom when a mercenaries coup was basically being engineered. But even then we have seen that how in Maldives some anti-India feelings are gaining ground, how some groups are active there who basically kind of try to preach anti-India sentiments and feelings. The Bangladesh, in spite of India's historic role in the birth of that nation, things have been going up and down so far the relationship is concerned, but recently we have seen that the kind of dispensation which is at the helm of affairs in Bangladesh, kind of approach they have adopted towards India, and India has always been very accommodative towards Bangladesh. So, one can see that things are looking up. Similarly, with Bhutan, of course, very friendly country. Historically, India has been very friendly with Bhutan, and the people's contact has also been very strong. But even recently, we have in recent times we have seen that some anti-India activities have been seen there. But I hope that the two governments will basically deal with this situation amicably. Afghanistan is a new nation, one can say, though it's an old nation, it has old history, but as in a new incarnation after 9/11, after the end of the Taliban's regime, and the attempt to form a democratic government in Afghanistan is a new development, and India is basically pinning a lot of hopes on the rise of new Afghanistan, because India has had a traditional ties with Afghanistan, and it believes that in coming years Afghanistan will play a very important role for South Asian cooperation and for the growth and rise of South Asia in world affairs. So, this is how one can see that India's neighbourhood diplomacy has been going on for last 6 decades. In spite of all irritants, Indian policy makers are hoping for a better future both for India and for the South Asia. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, for the very interesting talk and lecture for us on India's neighbourhood diplomacy, covering its relationship with the various countries around it. And friends, with this I would like to conclude our lecture, bring this to a close by thanking sir. Thank you so much, sir, for sparing your valuable time. And friends, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day ahead.